says, and number 2 of it says, the minister may, after consulting the relevant sectors, set numerical targets for any national economic sector. So it isn't necessarily that the minister would have done it wholeheartedly, but would have done it after consulting the relevant sectors first. Is that not the case?
No, because the minister said and pretended, and this is the norm, to have consulted. We're not sure who she consulted. Where was there?
Would you then would you be willing to accept these quotas if indeed there is proof of minutes, for example, of this consultation?
Absolutely not, as I've just explained to you.
But Michael, deregulation means that companies get to do things their own way, that people get to ultimately, and if you leave it to people's devices, they won't necessarily work for society's best interest. Companies are focused more on profits than they are on people.
Well, correct. But when you focus on profits, you're not worried about whether you're going to employ white, black, colored, Indian, women. And most of my clients happen to be from the previously disadvantaged community, most of them.
But isn't that because of BEE in itself, which has meant that these companies will be able to get some sort of tax regulation kickback from ultimately hiring more people from previously disadvantaged communities?
Well, then you've just proved my point. That's one of the ways.
Guys, so you see, this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy analyzing South Africa from the outsider perspective. Just trying to take a look at, the multiple arguments around issues like Labor Day. Labor Day, I think I was listening to Julius Malema's speech on Labor Day. I didn't complete it anyway. I think I'm going to complete it soon. And he was having a different perspective from this labor rep's perspective. I think his name is... let me get his name correctly now. His name is actually the DA Labour spokesperson, Michael Bagrime, all right? Michael Bagrime is not happy with the celebrations of Labor Day in South Africa. He actually argues that South Africa should be lamenting Labor Day in South Africa because the whole thing with labor in South Africa, we know that it has a really, long historical tradition and all of that, and it's not as encouraging, especially to this labor spokesperson for the day. He actually argues that there's a legislation that actually tells employers to have a certain numerical quota on who they employ and all of that, and he thinks that this is madness. He actually feels that this is madness because to actually put a set of borders on how flexible a business can be would actually be shutting down the prowess or the strength of that business to make profit, all right? So he actually thinks that implementing quotas, is kind of like a punishment to the business community in South Africa. And if you remember correctly, in the last podcast I had with Sama Sambit, he actually argued about how the whites actually in South Africa seem to be less favored, and this whole thing with BEE giving much more what Donald Trump was fighting for now. The whole thing with favoring blacks, disadvantaged people. Anyway, that's the word in South Africa now. Those that were historically disadvantaged in South Africa's history. BEE, if I'm listening to Michael correctly in this video, argues that they have to be favored, and the whites in these companies have to be retrenched and given, more rights to these victims of historical injustice in South Africa, all right? So Sama Sambit was actually arguing that, because of this whole thing with probably retrenching a white from a company and giving that position maybe to a black or a disabled or somebody who has been termed historically disadvantaged in South Africa, many whites have now gone into business creation, creating employment, all right, creating opportunities to now hire, more people. And most of these people now, according to the legislature of this Employment Equity Amendment Act, would now be those who are actually so they are being punished. That's according to Sama Sambit anyway, most of the whites seem to be punished probably because of this law, but now they have gone to create, or they are now going to, although in the midst of this whole thing, in their bid to create businesses, many of them have actually gone into drugs and all of that. But Sama Sambit argued that most of them have gone to create businesses, and it's these businesses now that actually would now employ most of these people who are said to be historically disadvantaged in South Africa's history. And so Michael Bagram here is actually arguing that when he just looks at the legislature, this Employment Equity Amendment Act. He just feels that it's a punishment. It's a way to just punish the business community. He actually argues that, in terms of consultation, he has a problem with this word consultation, because it seems that the legislation actually compels the minister in charge of this whole act to consult the companies, prior to implementing this whole thing with the quotas and all of that. But Michael Bagram is actually arguing that the problem doesn't necessarily lie, that in fact, the minister, they've not really seen the minister consulting. But now, the problem lies in the word consulting, because according to him, he has been doing retrenchment a lot in many companies. He feels that consulting means entering into an agreement with a preconceived notion. So in other words, you can consult with somebody who you want to fire, but then you still fire that worker. All right. And so in order to kind of like water down the whole effect of the whole thing, they use that word, and that is what Michael Bagram is actually arguing. And this is what the DA seems to want to be taken to court to challenge this act, saying that it might be possible for the minister to consult the company, but they consult from a place of a preconceived notion that they will still do what they want to do, but then they have to consult. And so they want to unravel or deconstruct that term, because they think that it's leading to what is a bad law. All right. So really powerful interview he has with Arabile here. And I think it's really important that everyone should watch this today, especially if you're really one who believes in South Africa. Many people want to invest in South Africa. Many people want to do business in South Africa. South Africa is an excellent country, but in understanding these BEE laws and really thinking about, especially one part of this interview I enjoyed from Michael, he actually argued that, there's this so popular saying that actually says that, I think it was it Socrates or Plato? Somebody actually said that if you keep on doing the same thing over and over again and expecting, the different result, then that's actually insanity. So he actually calls this approach, this last 20 years or 30 years of trying to correct the wrongs of the past by using these same laws that have not really resulted in anything positive change, so to speak, in South Africa. He actually argues that there has to be a different approach. And this is actually what I think many of us have to really we have to try to listen to this interview to the end and understand the argument, so that we can now start slowly thinking about alternatives. I don't know if the ANC might be ready for such a discussion, but alternatives on how to really correct this whole historical injustices of the past. Many parties like the AFF and all that think that the state should be in full control of probably ownership of the land, and then by that they will be able to also control how to really manage these historical injustices. But we also know that South Africa has other people. There's I don't like to use this categorization, but there are blacks, whites, Indians, and colored. There are other people who have different relationships to the history of South Africa, and so there has to be a wisdom that must be drafted in order to allow this whole thing with correcting the injustices of the past. And Michael Bagram doesn't think that this whole thing with the Employment Equity Amendment Act is actually a wise way. Let's quickly listen to his arguments. Really brilliant. I would advise you guys watch this interview to the end, because it opens a lot of issues that we should really be considering if we really love South Africa. And share your thoughts in the comments.
I wanted to ask if you could, in simple terms for us, just highlight and share with us what exactly it is that the DA is challenging when it comes to particularly 15A of the Employment Amendment Act.
Thank you. Yes, it's wonderful to celebrate Workers' Day, but we have quite a lot to think about, in the sense that we shouldn't be actually celebrating. We should be lamenting some of the problems that we have on Workers' Day in South Africa. It being said that we're almost at 42% unemployment, and it seems to be getting worse. Now, we've had the employment equity legislation for over 20 years. And for over 20 years, it's not been effective at all. In fact, it's been destructive. And that's the essence of social engineering. Now, when you have a look at it, we've had a legislation in place telling the companies, the employers, the sole proprietors, that they should actually try and correct the wrongs of the past, which the Democratic Alliance agrees with. We agree that there should be a correction to the wrongs of the past. However, when you start meddling and when you start interfering with the whole economy, because that's what this is doing, you've got a problem. So 15A takes it one step further. It makes it worse. It's the whole idea of what was said by Einstein, that if you keep doing the same experiment and expect to have a different result, then it's madness. And here we have the madness. We've had the experiment. It's not worked. We should be going back to the drawing board. But now what they're saying in 15A is saying, well, we used to leave it up to the business community to try and correct the wrongs of the past by meeting certain targets. Now we're going to implement quotas. In other words, we're going to force it on you, regardless of whether it's going to be effective or not. And so what the minister's saying, and it's a blunt tool, he's saying, I'm just going to set targets. He can't tell us how he came to the she. It was, unfortunately, the previous minister that put it together, Minister Meth, has now inherited, with aplomb, has inherited this mess. But what we've got now is the ministry telling us that the business community will hit X targets. So they've taken all the business communities, they've put them into lumps, and they've said, right, you will now meet this target, otherwise you're going to pay 1.5 million rand or 10% of your turnover or whatever. They're really just looking to punish the business community, and the reaction from the business community is, well, we won't employ. We will shrink. We will outsource. Yeah.
Michael, let me ask you this then, and you touched on quite a few issues, and we'll hopefully try to dissect them as much as possible. Would these quotas have not been put in place because of consultations and the need then for equality? And I will point then straight to 15A of the Employment Amendment Act then, which says, and number 2 of it says, the minister may, after consulting the relevant sectors and with the advice of the Commission, set numerical targets for any national economic sector identified in terms of the subsection. So it isn't necessarily that he would have done it, that the minister would have done it wholeheartedly, but would have done it after consulting the relevant sectors first. Is that not the case?
No, because the minister said and pretended, and this is the norm, to have consulted. We're not sure who she consulted with, or the previous minister he consulted with. When asked, most of the industry, all of the industries said, well, we don't remember any consultation. It becomes an impossible task. You can't go out to every industry and say, well, we're going to consult. I can go and consult with my next door neighbor and say, well, I've consulted. And so therefore I'm going to change the whole neighborhood because my next door neighbor and I have an idea that we should have a one-way street in our road. That's not consultation. And consultation is a strange word. I've been practicing labor law now for 40 years. And it says before you retrench, you need to consult. It doesn't mean you have to negotiate. I can consult. I can say, I hear you. I know you've disagreed with me, but I'm going ahead anyway. That's what consultation is. So you've got to be very careful of the wording as well. I don't believe that even though the wording is bad and even though the term consultation is something that doesn't take you anywhere, I don't believe the minister consulted. I don't believe the previous minister consulted or the current minister consulted. Yeah. And we don't have any evidence of that. I'd like to see the minutes of those consultations and who was consulted. If the previous minister consulted 3 or 4 people in his portfolio committee and came back and reported on it, I was there.
So would you be willing to accept these quotas if indeed there is proof of minutes, for example, of this consultation?
Absolutely not, as I've just explained to you. Consultation is just that. It says, I'll consult. I do retrenchments every week.
Yeah.
Every week we go out and consult with the trade union. The trade unions always feed back saying no. And we then say, okay, we've consulted, we're going ahead. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that you can go in with a preconceived idea and you can actually come out with that idea at the end, even after consultation. So it's a bad concept altogether. A quota is a bad concept. It's wrong. The National Party, under the nationalist government in South Africa, taught us just that. Michael, they believed in social engineering.
Michael, according to, I think it's part of your statement here, if I'm not mistaken as well then, you say where companies once set their own equity goals based on context and the available labor force, they are now compelled to meet government-imposed demographic targets. Do companies not work within the scope of a government and its laws? And if these are the laws then instituted by a government, then companies are enforced and entrenched to ultimately do so, no matter what we ultimately think of them.
That's the point. That's why we're challenging the law. That's why you've got to go to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has got to say it's bad law. Look, the Democratic Alliance always works within the law. And that's why we look at this and say, but this is bad law. It goes against our Constitution, and therefore we need to challenge it. We can't send a message out to the business community saying, there's law, break the law. That's not us. That's other parties, EFF or Umkhonto. What we do is we very much adhere to the Constitution. We respect, admire, and praise the Constitution. And when you admire and praise the Constitution, you want law to be in line with that Constitution. So the Democratic Alliance, which is a constitutional party, will go to the Constitutional Court and say, when you're putting a quota onto a business, this is not helping. We have a history.
Michael,
this is not out of the blue. This is 20 years of history.
So, Michael, should companies then be allowed to make their own rules in this regard?
No. What we're saying is, let's go back to the drawing board, put together a way in which we could try and right the wrongs of the past. We've got 20 years. We've got an experiment for 20 years. It hasn't righted the wrongs of the past. And so what we're saying is we need to go back. It can't just be unchecked ability of a minister just to enforce rigid quotas. What we need to do is, and we've explained ways and means of growing the economy. It's simple. You deregulate instead of more regulations. And the whole world is telling us, even the government, the current government is saying, we understand that there is a need to deregulate. Because in that same piece of legislation, they're now putting that if your business is under 50 people, we're going to actually exempt you from this. Why? Because they know that the legislation will hamper the small business sector, and it's the small business sector that is creating jobs. And so you don't want to hamper it. So they've actually proved the DA's case by actually taking the sector that should be creating the most jobs and then deregulating it. They should deregulate the entire business community of that. It's quite simple. Our previous few ministers ago of finance said just that. He said, if you uncoupled the businesses from the bargaining councils, and at the time he said that would create 2 million jobs. Today, I believe it would create 5 million jobs just by a stroke of the pen. And that's what we really want to do. Once you're creating jobs, then you bring in the whole economy, and you're bringing in everyone. It doesn't matter what color they are.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, we do need to, and you've said that it's not this, this case is not about resisting redress, meaning that it's not about not addressing the issues of the past. So how then do we help those that have been disadvantaged previously and still are disadvantaged heavily now, and ensure that they are advantaged in future then without these quotas? How do we do that?
Well, it's simple, and I started explaining that. First of all, there's deregulation, especially in the small business sector, and that would probably solve a lot of our problems.
But Michael, deregulation means that companies get to do things their own way, that people get to ultimately, and if you leave it to people's devices, they won't necessarily work for society's best interest. Companies are focused more on profits than they are on people.
Well, correct. But when you're focused on profits, you're not worried about whether you're going to employ white, black, colored, Indian, women, disabled. Let me explain to you. I've been a labor lawyer now for 40 years. I practice in the CCMA and the Labor Court regularly, once a week. And I know that you have legislation now that says if you don't take in an individual because he's black or because he's disabled, that you can approach the CCMA, the Labor Court, in a plethora of bodies. Now, how many cases have I done like that? I get people phoning me all day. I get 20, 30 calls a day. No one in the last 10 years has come forward and said, I didn't get the job because I'm black. I've got some proof and I didn't get it because I'm black. I didn't get it because I'm disabled. Not one person. Now, I do hundreds of cases. So what you're telling me, if left to our own devices, the companies will not employ black people, that's not true. Because I have empirical evidence. I can show you from my book, my fee book, that there's nothing like that. People phone me all the time. And most of my clients happen to be from the previously disadvantaged community, most of them.
But isn't
Now,
that because of BEE in itself, which has meant that these companies will be able to get some sort of tax regulation kickback from ultimately hiring more people from previously disadvantaged communities?
Well, then you've just proved my point. That's one of the ways in which you can possibly encourage that. But people are struggling. The economy is shrinking. People are retrenching every day. Now, what you're doing over here with this quotas, forced quotas, what you're doing is you're saying to companies, retrench your white, male, possibly people from the advantaged community, retrench them, bring in others. That's ridiculous, because what
look,
you're doing then is you're getting rid of... that's what's happening.
I'm not sure the Act says retrench some, but I think in your hiring process, it's about addressing the social ills of the past in the country. And ultimately, it's like, for example, if people are struggling and you don't then help them and you help everybody the same, you haven't actually addressed the issue of previously disadvantaged communities in the country. And that's what you're trying to fix. So you should specialize or focus a little bit more on those than everyone else. Surely that's the way it should work.
It is, but the person's got to be competent, fit for purpose, and able to make the profit. Because if you're not going to make profit, then the business is going to suffer, and then everyone suffers. So you're not right. If you've set a quota, then you're putting pressure on that company to say, I need to bring in more black females. And if I need to bring in more black females and I'm not expanding, that's the first problem, then I must retrench to make way. If I am expanding, then you're saying to me, employ people who are not fit for purpose. And I choose, and again, I'm telling you right now, anyone, that people are very focused on this, anyone that feels that they didn't get a job and they were fit for purpose, but they were black, they would come forward very quickly. Go to the CCMA, have a look at the figures. And we have very, very few cases of that nature. So I'm giving you empirical evidence, not philosophy. I'm not giving you something that is pie in the sky. I'm telling you right now that we don't have that scenario in South Africa. What we need to do is we need to grow the economy. We need to improve our systems. We need to improve training. We need to bring back technical colleges.
Yep.
That's the hard yards. Our government wants the quick fix, but I want the hard yards.
I don't think I disagree with you in what this country and economy needs ultimately. And all I'm saying is, if you're able to redress the issues of the past through a quota system that does employ qualified, previously disadvantaged people over and above those from an advantaged community, that is perhaps addressing the issues of the past in itself. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this case goes. Michael, I would love to have us back on this convo, and let's do it again, please. It certainly will be fascinating, and we'll see how the court case in itself as well goes. We have run out of time, but